Just wanted to say, for the sake of the recording, this is Oregon Cooperative Housing Network organizing meeting the evening of October 14th. We have about a dozen people here. And I'm Tim McCormick, co-organizing this with Garland. And I'm a housing researcher and organizer activist based in Portland in Northern California. And coming to housing cooperatives from actually a couple angles. One is many years of living in varied shared warehouse, et cetera, housing. I don't think any officially co-op, but in various other ways. And then actually a whole other standpoint, I've been working on cooperatives in product and project management coming out of my past former life as a software product manager. And I'm actually interested in cooperative organization from the early stages of a project in things like contribution tracking, sharing equity at a much earlier phase than the sort of equity options and things that emerge with startups. Anyway, I'll just leave it there and continue on, but wanted to let people know we are recording, and that's mainly for the purpose of being able to include and onboard people later and not feel they missed the secret cabal meeting. Okay, someone else want to start?
Hey there, guys. Andrew Heben, background in planning and design, work with Square One Villages based in Eugene, and we've been developing housing co-ops for the past few years, and interested in connecting with others that are interested in doing it.
Let's move on with the agenda. Next up, we have 3 presentations. I'll kick it off with a presentation about cooperatives in general. And then Andrew will give us a presentation about Square One Villages in Eugene. And then Claudia and Bill will give us a presentation about the Park Vista Cooperative here in Portland. I created this presentation earlier this year because I keep on talking about co-ops and people keep on saying, what's that? And so I am interested in cooperative housing, but also what I'm calling cooperative housing plus, which involves the integration of the ability to perform an economic activity, such as a food co-op is a great example of an economic activity that can also provide jobs and other economic services beyond just housing. The need for housing cooperatives, however, is only growing. So this graph from Fred, St. Louis Federal Reserve Branch, shows the home mortgages held by the bottom 50% of the economic pyramid since 2009. And you can see how essentially lower income people have been losing when it comes to the opportunity to own a home in this country ever since the Great Recession. And here in Portland, permits for new apartment construction have plummeted since 2017. And there's 3 major factors involved with that. The first is inclusionary housing. The city's program requirements do not follow best practices, and as a result are driving multifamily construction out of the city. New construction rentals no longer pencil because the high end of the market is saturated and everything below that no longer pencils. And the development industry's fear of condominiums due to construction defect liability concerns means that new multifamily buildings are not being brought to market for sale, because the only way to sell an apartment is a condo, according to what most people know. I don't know that it is an exaggeration to say that this is the economic affordability crisis of late-stage capitalism. That may be exactly accurate. Hard costs have increased faster than incomes or rents, and it no longer pencils to develop new profit-dependent market rate housing that is affordable to middle-income households in the transit-served locations of our city. This graph shows the softwood lumber prices. That's the type of lumber used for construction. You can see how it just skyrocketed last year. It's since come down a little bit from these levels, but it's still contributing to historically high construction hard costs. So what is a cooperative? A cooperative is an entity that is jointly owned and operated by its members. for their mutual benefit and to meet their common human, economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. A housing cooperative is a nonprofit corporation that owns real estate containing one or more residential buildings that is owned and controlled by its member residents. Membership, and thus the right to occupancy, is granted by the way of the purchase of a share in the cooperative, and each shareholder is granted the right to occupy one legal unit. And by the way, all the photos in this presentation are from Vauban, Germany, which is a cooperatively developed and managed district. A housing plus cooperative is a housing cooperative that contains non-residential space that is used to produce economic opportunity for its members. And the non-residential space can be managed to provide income to the cooperative to help pay for its expenses. And it can also be managed to provide economic opportunity for cooperative members in the forms of jobs or space within which to conduct entrepreneurial activities. There's two general broad categories of housing cooperatives. The first is non-ownership, non-equity, or continuing cooperatives, where the occupancy rights granted are subject to an occupancy agreement, similar to a lease. And this also includes a non-share co-op model that is often used for student housing, in which fee-paying members obtain the right to occupy a bedroom and share communal resources. The other type of co-op is an ownership, an equity or limited equity cooperative, where occupancy rights granted by purchase agreements and legal instruments registered on title. Here's a little graph of that. So basically you have a type of cooperative that's a lot more like a condominium and a type of cooperative that's a lot more like a rental. And of both of those, there are flavors that are more or less affordable. Housing cooperatives, because it's a single corporation, have the ability to obtain financing for the whole building, a central or building mortgage or a whole cooperative loan. And this is a kind of a unique ability of a cooperative. And it's available to both ownership and non-ownership flavors of cooperative. For the ownership flavor, it means that the co-op can essentially write its own mortgage to people who want to buy in, or they can bring their own financing. And a lot of that depends on where you are and what the lending ecosystem looks like and the flavor of loan that the whole co-op has taken out, if it has. The rental alternative is just like any other rental, where you essentially you pay a fee, maybe equal to first and last and security deposit, something on that order of magnitude, and then you pay something like a monthly rent to allow the co-op to service its note. So housing plus cooperatives could include a basket of benefits, or do include a basket of benefits where they exist, that include pathways to equitable outcomes, economic opportunity, live work on a site scale, risk distribution for those who are engaging in economic activities or entrepreneurial activities. And there's a role to cooperate with other organizations such as unions and guilds to provide training and apprenticeship and mentorship activities. Cooperatives have been around for something like 170 years now. The first cooperatives were started in New York City in the 1850s. It's a very, very mature economic model, and as such has developed 4 pillars of cooperative governance. Those 4 pillars are teaming, democracy, strategic leadership, and accountable empowerment. And it's key to allowing human beings to operate effectively with other human beings to solve for common goals. And it consists of, in particular, answering key questions, defining roles and responsibilities clearly, and establishing processes for setting expectations and ensuring accountability. There's also another benefit that comes from cooperatives, which is that the ongoing operations of cooperative communities can help to solve the operations problem that contributes to multifamily affordability issues. In particular, that the higher operations cost per home for multifamily communities in comparison to single-family homes. As you can buy a home and just let it go. There's no one, when you buy a single-family home, that makes you maintain that home. It's your choice whether you engage in preventive maintenance activities or not. But for a multifamily building, lenders will require that reserves be set aside to allow for the preservation and maintenance of the building. Within a cooperative, there's something called a work job system, may go by other names as well, where each co-op member is responsible for a unique group of tasks. And some of these tasks are regular and some are intermittent. But those jobs are assigned or chosen at co-op meetings. All the essential work jobs are assigned to members first, and then the more peripheral and yet still very important jobs are open for selection. And the essential work jobs are intentionally broken apart as small as logically possible to create the greatest flexibility. And the work jobs are matched to individual member differences and skills. So basically, cooperative members can engage in volunteer labor to bring down the operations cost for the cooperative. Around the world, Germany has the most cooperatives of any country, with over 2 million homes occupied by over 4 million member residents. And Germany also has a unique feature in the cooperative system, the ability to hold multiple co-op memberships and other avenues to use the co-op as an investment and savings plan. In the US, we have about 1.2 million homes within about 6,400 housing cooperatives occupied by about 3.2 million member residents. Sweden has a bit over 1 million homes occupied by a bit under 2 million member residents, operating under 3 national cooperative umbrella organizations. Denmark, while it only has 778,000 homes in co-ops, has the largest share of its housing stock of any country in the world that is cooperatively held. Over a quarter of the housing stock in Denmark is cooperatively held. And then rounding out the list of the top co-op countries in the world are Norway, Canada, and Australia. I think that partially due to the crisis that was before mentioned, there really could be a cooperative decade that we're entering into, where cooperatives could become the acknowledged leader in economic, social, and environmental sustainability. It could become the business model preferred by people and the fastest growing form of enterprise. But what's needed to enable more cooperatives is wider knowledge of this option, increased access to seed funding for cooperative startups, and communities coming together to make it happen. And so that is my lightning talk on cooperatives. And
yeah, so Andrew Heben, I work with Square One Villages. We're developing permanently affordable housing co-ops in Lane County, Oregon. Garland kind of hit on this already, but I thought I'd start by just overviewing the main types of co-ops. You have market rate co-ops, which basically act like condos, where you can sell at whatever the market will bear, aside from the fact that rather than owning your individual dwelling, you own an equal share of the overall building or development. There's a limited equity co-op, in which those shares are basically the appreciation of the value of your share is limited by a formula in order to preserve affordability for future co-op members. And then there's a leasehold co-op in which there is no equity, but the co-op doesn't have equity itself. It leases the building and the property from another entity. And this is often done because of public subsidies that prevent resident ownership. And I introduce this because the types of co-ops that we have developed so far are both leasehold co-ops and limited co-ops. And Garland asked me to introduce those to you guys. So I threw together a few slides. The first co-op we opened was in 2018, Emerald Village, Eugene. It's 22 tiny homes on an acre, and it is a leasehold co-op, and it is designed for folks making under 50% area median income. Here are just a few photos. It's a pretty unique project in that it's a tiny home village, and a bunch of architects and builders came together to design and build a home. And so all of the homes are kind of unique and different. And this was kind of our first attempt of doing a co-op. Prior to that, we did the Opportunity Village back in 2013, which is more of a transitional shelter model, similar to Dignity Village and a number of other villages in Portland that have come up, where it's designed to be self-governed by the residents. And we wanted to transition to a more permanent housing model, and the co-op structure was kind of the formalization of what we were already doing in places like Opportunity Village. In 2020, we opened the Cottage Village Co-op, which was designed to replicate what we did at Emerald Village in a rural community with fewer resources. So this one is in Cottage Grove, Oregon, about a half hour south of Eugene. Similar size site, but lower density limits in a rural community. So we were only able to put 13 units on the project. Here are just a few pictures of the finished product. And so those were our first two co-ops. They were both leasehold co-ops in which Square One owns the property and leases it to the co-op. And after doing both of those, we got a grant from Meyer Memorial Trust to kind of further research and develop the housing model that we had kind of been developing from the ground up, from Opportunity Village to Emerald Village to Cottage Village. So through that research, we called it the Village Model, and it has its own website, and it covers a few different topics, but what we're here tonight to discuss is the ownership structure. And what we landed on was a cooperative land trust housing model. And so this kind of evolved from the leasehold co-op in that we are looking to develop limited equity co-ops that actually own the building and improvements, but Square One retains ownership of the underlying land. This is a nice little graphic that kind of shows the division of roles and responsibilities. So the co-op, you know, it operates like a limited equity co-op, like we've been talking, but it has an ongoing partnership with a community land trust, and there's a ground lease that ties the two parties together. And this allows, well, I guess I'll get into that on the next slide here. Why combine a community land trust with a co-op? So the three main reasons that we found: for one, accessible home ownership. Like Garland was talking, you can do a single mortgage for the entire development, and each person is a share owner of that development. And what that does is it doesn't require each member to qualify for a mortgage individually. So it allows you to create a pathway to home ownership for folks that are considered unbankable or unable to qualify for a mortgage individually. You know, currently, I think, you know, any types of affordable housing that is doing home ownership is looking at people around 80% AMI, whereas a co-op model can provide a pathway to home ownership for folks under 60% AMI, which typically is only developed as low-income rental housing. Permanent affordability. So a limited equity co-op can restrict the sale of the share, but what has happened historically is that, you know, the co-op reserves the right to amend its bylaws. So you have a lot of co-ops that were developed with public subsidy in the 60s and 70s. And once the affordability requirements expired, they converted to a market rate co-op and cashed out, and it's no longer affordable housing. Ongoing relationship with a community land trust ensures something like that won't ever happen. And it also provides, you know, sort of an umbrella entity through the community land trust that can provide ongoing training and support to the co-op on how to manage a co-op successfully. And third is the low risk investment. It's a multi-layered ownership structure. And so the way I like to talk about this, and this diagram kind of is a quick overview of the relationship of the three different parties. So you have the residents of the co-op here, a proprietary lease and a membership agreement tie them as equal owners of the limited equity co-op. And the limited equity co-op has a ground lease with the community land trust. And I describe it as a low risk investment because, you know, if something happens, a default by an individual member, the co-op has an interest in making that work and figuring out the solution in some way or another. And if the limited equity can't figure it out, then the community land trust also serves as a backstop with an interest in resolving the situation And so what you find is that these types of projects have much lower rates of default than traditional conventional housing. So we were able to implement this CLT LEC model in a pilot project in Springfield. It's a single family lot. That was also a pilot project for looking at how we can implement the HB 2001 zoning changes, where you're putting more urban infill on R1 lots. This was ahead of that though, and so this is technically only 2 dwellings, a single family house and an accessory dwelling unit, but the single family house is divided into 4 private suites. You can kind of see that in the floor plans here. Each one of these is about a 400 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment. And in the back, you have 2 of those stacked, one on the ground floor and one on the top floor. And yeah, I think this is a really exciting project. Total development costs were $600,000. So we were able to do that at just $100,000 per suite. Let's see, it's a $10,000 share purchase and a $770 monthly carrying charge. So that's designed to be affordable to someone at 60% AMI. And in co-op lingo, a carrying charge is basically akin to rent. So it's rent that individual members are paying to themselves, paying to the co-op. So that covers utilities, maintenance, long-term reserves, administration, the ground lease fee to the CLT, those types of things. And I think this is a really exciting model. It came in at half the development costs, or under half the cost. You know, a typical low-income rental housing unit is costing upwards of $250K per unit to develop, with just about 100% of that being subsidy, whereas 70%, or no, let's 60% of the project funded here was through a mortgage. 20% was through subsidy acquired by, well, I guess 20% was subsidy acquired by Square One, and then 20% was resident equity. So it was actually a $20,000 share purchase, but we were able to get CDBG homeowner down payment assistance that covered half of that, which meant it only cost $10,000 for each homeowner. So this is a model that we're really excited about. It's much smaller than our other projects, but due to coming zoning changes, we think it can have, you know, pretty big impact, because there's lots of R1 lots that can be redeveloped under this kind of concept. And we're also working on, I should say that this one's also serving a slightly higher income than our other projects too. So we're looking at the 60 to 80% range for this project. And then we're looking to replicate that model on a much larger scale. So this is plans for a Peace Village co-op back in Eugene, 70 units, limited equity co-op. It's actually a existing church, Peace Presbyterian Church, but it's kind of a dying congregation. There's less than 30 members in the congregation now, and it's kind of shrinking. But they have, you know, 9,000 square feet of existing buildings and 3 acres of land. And they partnered with us to develop some affordable housing on it. And we actually are buying the property from them and converting their fellowship hall into the common facility. And they'll lease back the church building from us to use a few days a week. And it's just a floor plan. And then I just wanted to conclude, I jotted down some notes. I think why I'm excited in terms of attending a meeting like this, in terms of forming an Oregon cooperative housing network. I think, you know, as Garland's slides pointed out, you know, housing co-ops are uniquely positioned to address several problems in the current housing market. And especially in light of zoning changes under HB 2001, where we're able to infill more residential units on single family lots. You know, if we don't use the co-op model, that's just going to create a bigger gap between owners and renters and the commodification of housing. because all of a sudden, if we have 4 to 6, say 4 units on a lot, that's going to be even more inaccessible to average people. So you're going to have large entities buying up lots and doing 4 to 6 rental units on them is kind of the alternative. And so that's one of the reasons that I think co-ops are kind of uniquely positioned to become more prevalent in Oregon. And then you have SB 08, which creates a 200% density bonus if your housing is income restricted for folks with low income. So there's all kind of indicators pointing to the fact that co-ops are an important thing for us to figure out, yet housing co-ops are a foreign concept in Oregon. But I don't think that's because there's any sort of difference between Oregonians and maybe areas where places where co-ops are more prevalent. It just hasn't been a common thing here, and condos have been the go-to rather than co-ops. And I guess those with an interest and experience in developing housing co-ops in Oregon need to collaborate under the common interest of changing that. So that would be my interest in what this group might come together to do. I know, we kind of feel like we don't have a lot of allies in terms of people out there developing co-ops. And so if we can come together and try to influence bigger change, I think that would be great. I think 3 main things that a group like this could do would be familiarize lenders with housing co-ops and demonstrate that they're a stable investment, influence state legislation to recognize and support housing co-ops, and incentivize the development of more housing co-ops within Oregon cities and counties. And I'll conclude there.
Thanks, Andrew. That is fantastic and very inspirational, because you're developing new co-ops in Oregon, and possibly the only new co-ops currently being developed in Oregon. So we need to stoke that fire and make it spread. Although maybe I shouldn't use that metaphor given what's happening over the past summers. But next up, let's hear about Park Vista Co-op. And what's going to happen here is I'm going to share some visuals of Park Vista Co-op, and Claudia and Bill are going to tell us all about it.
Great. The first thing to know is this is a mid-century modern 1960 building. It's almost entirely 2-bedroom, 2-bath units. Several of them have been combined because of its origin. There are about 7 units that are half size, 58 units, 91 residents, northwest corner of Vista Avenue, which is 23rd extended south, and Park Place. So we're a block and a half south of the east entrance of east of the main entrance to Washington Park. It's incorporated as a for-profit corporation. It has bylaws. Those of us that own here do not own real estate. We own shares in the corporation that are attached to a proprietary lease, like any other market rate co-op. A couple of particular things: there are no rentals allowed here. And one of the major problems faced by people who wish to buy here, that also results in the kind of people that live here, is it's virtually impossible, if not impossible, to get mortgage financing for co-ops here. The co-op we lived in DC, there were at least 15 lenders, many names you would recognize, that finance mortgages in that building. Claudia, go ahead.
No, you're doing the organization.
So the main thing that is important, anybody that buys an apartment here has to be interviewed and approved by the board of directors. We have a very strong board of directors. We have a property management firm that provides some of the assistance, and a very active board that does a number of things. Contractors like this form when they figure out we're not a homeowners association with multiple interests that they have to deal with, but a single corporation. I think one of the most important things is in utilities. We have one electric meter for the building that pays the rate, and then that's individually metered to each unit. So we can, as individual apartment occupiers, residents, pay a much lower rate for electricity than would otherwise be available. Some people call it a proprietary lease, other people call it an ownership contract. We have to agree by house rules. And the thing that's remarkable about this co-op and many co-ops, including the one we lived in before, but especially this one, is the amount of resident involvement, not only in the governance, but the social activities that surround it. I noticed one person said they had lived in co-housing. It's not quite that active, but it's much different than the average condominium.
So I want to talk just a little bit about what we think the pros are financially to cooperative housing. We have one building here and one budget for that building, and that's what the focus has been. I spent 2 years as president and then 2 years as treasurer, just ended this past May. We think about this entire building, and when you think of other forms of housing, except for a single family house, the economic and financial interests are split. Some is owned by the real estate owner, some is an HOA. And we really like this financial model better. You have one budget, one building, and a strong board of directors, but democratically elected to oversee the sustainability of that model. So there's a lot of shareholder control and input. I want to say one word about the interview. It is predominantly financially oriented to make sure that in this market-based co-op, the residents can sustain their ability to live in their apartment, because unlike a condo, we can foreclose in 1 month on the people here. We can just take their shares away. And so that also really, in a way, encourages everybody to, in my opinion, in my experience, in the 25 years we've lived in market-based co-ops, help. We're attractive to commercial lenders because we are a corporation, and so we have a very strong relationship with Northwest Bank. And while we don't have a mortgage, I don't know whether there was one back in 1960. We do have 2 commercial loans, which the building holds as a corporation rather than individuals. We did an experiment allowing individuals to buy out their share of the loan. That was tough, and we did that with our elevator loan. I don't know whether we will do that again. But a corporation in general can act with a fair amount of speed. But it does take a good democracy, in my opinion, to make sure. It takes good communication with the shareholders and the residents. And then I'm going to continue what some of the cons and the problems are. And man, Andrew, did I like that last slide of yours, because we have run into all of those things. We don't have financing. We have searched and searched and searched for a lender. We would give a lender a monopoly in this building. They would be able to work with folks who are relatively well off financially, because we are a market-based co-op. Our sales prices are probably 20 to 40% or more below condos around here, because one of the primary reasons being you got to pay cash for your apartment. It's an entirely cash transaction. There's very little realtor knowledge. We have invested hours with every realtor that tries to sell one of these apartments to help them understand what a co-op is. And it still ends up with, well, there are a lot of rules. I'm like, no, that's the way they sell it. So, and there's some real misinformation around there, and we get realtor contracts that are talking about the condominium and don't get the share part of it. And that before COVID, we were actually going to begin to host kind of realtor meetings, if you will, to try and get them to understand what this was. And that also goes to the taxing authorities. So the property tax people in Multnomah County do not know what to do with us. They simply don't. And of course, as I explained, our prices are below condominiums, but they want to compare us to a condominium. But that condominium has much higher sales prices. Or they want to compare us to a rental building where there's profit taking. And so we have successfully argued to lower our property taxes twice in the last 10 years. But talking to those folks is just like swimming through molasses. And in DC, co-ops were property tax advantaged. And equity co-op and equity limited co-ops, which was a primary tool in DC to prevent turning buildings, because that's what was happening as neighborhoods gentrified in DC. You know, they'd kick everybody out of the building and they turn the building. So DC requires first that you give the tenants of the building the opportunity to purchase it, and then both the government in DC and the nonprofits support cooperative development through that. And so a number of buildings have not turned because instead they've become limited equity co-ops. But this property tax stuff, and then, for example, because we are a for-profit corporation, we pay the corporate taxes, the new corporate tax that has been assessed, even though we don't have a profit out of which to pay that tax, except that now, of course, we're collecting more in fees from all of us in order to do that. Although co-ops do pay, in my experience, market-based co-ops, I'm not experienced in limited equity co-ops, they do pay income taxes as a corporation, as do other co-ops. So financially, there are some really big drawbacks in Oregon. It really surprised us coming from the DC landscape about these financial drawbacks. And Andrew, that's why I really like that final slide you showed of what co-ops could do. And Bill, you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, just follow up on one thing. Our co-op fees here include property taxes, which any condo, that's not the case. And so it's really hard for people to compare. The reason we bought here was that the apartments here were so much less than comparable condos that we looked at anywhere. And just on the property tax abatement that they have in DC for co-ops, we had a slightly larger co-op in DC. We paid 1/3 of the property taxes that we pay for a smaller co-op here in Portland. And that as things move down the road, especially with more limited equity co-ops. I think that's something that really needs to be paid attention to. And we've often thought that this is one of the only market rate co-ops around. I keep hearing rumors that there are others around, but the problem is, and this affects financing, there's really not adequate enabling legislation for co-ops like that we want to see develop both market rate and limited equity.
So those were the points that we wrote down, Darlin, to talk about, and we would be delighted to answer any questions. You will see in this slide that Garland has up that while we do have children who live here, we do have families with children who live here, including a 2-year-old. The residents tend to be older because they sell a home and buy an apartment for cash. And so that limits our market terribly because we cannot get financing. So I don't know if people have questions, or Garland, how you want to take this from here. I know you all had hoped for a 7 o'clock end, and it's 7:05.
7:30.
Oh, maybe a 7:30 end, Bill tells me so.
Oh yeah, no, we are not done yet. So now, I guess we are running a little bit late. We're about 20 minutes behind schedule, and I'm not completely wedded to the 7:30 in time. I just wanted to give an out for people who have other things to do this evening, but we can stay on the Zoom line until 8 or longer if we engage in a good discussion. So right now I just want to call the question. It looks like we have 15 people on this call, and so we could either break up into small groups if folks want to focus on a topic of discussion, or we can stay in this big room. But you know, there's multiple types of co-ops that we could talk about. The first is the existing co-ops, such as C Street and Park Vista. The second type would be construction of a new physical co-op. Again, that's like the work that Square One is doing. The third type would be the conversion of existing multifamily buildings into cooperatives. It's another way that we could grow the inventory of cooperatively held homes in the area. And then the fourth would be something like Square One's early projects, which would be incremental, like tiny home villages, like not necessarily permanent housing, but housing that allows much lower barriers to entry, so that people could form a cooperative and start living someplace first and then evolve that land over time. So that's the types of co-ops. We could talk about that. Each one of those have strategies that could lead to growing the co-op movement locally. And then there's also some questions that I think we should talk through as a group for the future of this group, including what populations do we want to serve? What sort of organizational development plans might make sense to follow in terms of how will potential shareholders learn how to operate a co-op? What sorts of models of co-op housing are we interested in, whether market rate or limited equity or zero equity or all of the above? What sorts of development strategy makes the most sense to pursue, whether it's developing new units or acquiring existing units, or all the above? What kind of acquisition financing plan, where's the money come from up front to create a new cooperative? And then what sort of areas of interest? Are we interested in all of Oregon, or are there all of Portland, or just specific neighborhoods? Where is the opportunity? So these are some of the questions that we outlined in advance. I'm going to stop talking now and ask you guys for questions, comments, and suggestions.